Judge Robert Spano, in the frame of freedom of expression, we're talking about the protection of sources for journalists. Essentially, why should journalists' sources be protected at all?
The question why journalist sources should be protected is intimately linked to the way in which we perceive and understand the role of the press in a democratic society. The law has often used the term public watchdog. So the press's role is to create a dynamic in democracy where discussions can take place, where public opinions can be created and debates can go on issues of controversy. And this means, of course, that journalists need to be able to obtain information. They can engage in research activities and they can get information from individuals, sources, who would not give the information unless they were entrusted with confidentiality, protecting them as being anonymous sources. So in that way, there is a clear dynamic between having the opportunity for a journalist to fulfill his role by receiving information which would not come to light unless the source is protected when giving this information.
And as a consequence then, what might happen if sources aren't protected?
The first thing that might happen is that sources would simply refrain from giving this information. We call this the chilling effect, and it's encapsulated in the term. It would chill sources from giving information, and this would undermine the role of the press when dealing with its functions, when doing this very important public function. And it would thus create a lack of information for the press to be able to do its job in the public interest.
In what ways might the right to the protection of sources be breached somehow?
Well, let's imagine a situation where a person calls a journalist at his office and says, I'm working for the government and I can give you information on a secret I have of things that are happening in government. The journalist says, fine, give me this information. He receives the information, and then the journalist publishes an article or a news report on the basis of these sources. Well, what could happen is you could have the police say, well, the giving of this information to the journalist is a breach of confidentiality. This was a civil servant that could not divulge this information and could request the journalist to give this information, and the journalist would say, no, this is my source, I do not divulge my source. Two things could happen then. One could be that the police could go to court and request a court order for the journalist to divulge this information, a disclosure order, and that of course is a very strong remedy for the government in wanting to divulge this information. An even stronger remedy would simply be that the police could search the premises of the journalist, both his home or his workplace. And that, of course, is a very drastic measure, which, for example, the European Court of Human Rights has said is one of the most drastic measures that could be used to try to receive information, get information from the journalist. Lastly, of course, we have seen situations where journalists deny revealing journalistic sources on the basis of court orders and have been held in contempt of court and have been detained on that basis. So there are various ways in which this could happen, and this in all situations would be an interference with the journalist's freedom of expression. And if it's not balanced, if the government does not have very strong reasons for doing this, it could be a violation of the freedom of expression. The freedom of the journalist to impart information, which is protected by the provisions on freedom of expression.
What happens then when it all goes wrong, or seemingly goes wrong? What can be said about information that's been obtained illegally or in some way, shape or form, breach of confidentiality?
Well, that is, of course, the classical scenario often in these cases where we're dealing with a balance to be struck between protecting the journalistic source on the one hand and upholding the law, preventing crime, because it can be in and of itself a crime to provide the information to the journalist. And there I think it is clear that one cannot say that the mere fact that the information given to the journalist is given in breach of confidentiality can in and of itself be enough for the protection of a journalistic source to be disrupted. There must be something more. So the mere fact that confidentiality laws or agreements are breached does not suffice in and of itself to be stronger than the protection of journalistic sources. So invariably here there needs to be a balance. What is the public interest in requiring the journalist to divulge the source? There can be situations, of course, where the public interest is so strong that it would tip the balance in favor of requiring the journalist to provide the information. But in general, if one, for example, looks at the case law of the European Court of Human Rights, the court has been very, very strong on protecting the right of journalists to not divulge the sources for their reports, and for good reason. The court has said there must be overriding considerations or requirements in the public interest for that to happen.
You talk about a balance there. Journalists, what, if any, would you say are their duties in this respect?
Well, it is clear when we discuss the duties of journalists, it is clear we have ethics rules which deal with journalistic procedures and so forth. And maybe rule number one there, which the courts are always mindful of upholding, is when a journalist puts forward statements in reports or news articles, and statements often are, for example, can almost be defamatory. They are alleging that a government minister or other private person has done something illegal or is divulging information. In those situations, the courts usually require that the journalist must factually substantiate his statements. So there must be a factual foundation for what the journalist claims. But that does not mean that the source of the foundation, if it's an anonymous source, needs to be divulged. But the journalist is always under a duty to be able to factually substantiate the statements he makes. And if that is not the case, if there seems to be a lack of a credible foundation for these statements, that can have an impact on the balancing between these interests, as I mentioned before.
So given the large number of agencies and other authorities that can monitor information, the sources of journalists being some of that information, and other factors in there as well, what future do you see for journalist sources?
There are two things that I would say. Firstly, the information age that we live in, where accessibility of information has become so much more open and so readily available than before, will have an impact on journalistic sourcing in general. Secondly, however, I think that this will mean that accessibility for journalists to receiving this information is going to be a lot more easy. It's going to be easier for journalists to find avenues in this regard. And let me perhaps in that finally say that I think that this will also have an impact on the culture of information. When information has become transparent as a starting point, the fact that journalists are able to receive information will become almost a norm, a commonality, more than it was before.
Robert Spano, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.